Hi everybody.
Hi everyone, and welcome to
Portal to the Paranormal. My name's Jojo.
I'm Sarah,
and I'm Jo,
and you're watching
Thriller Podcast, The Witch Edition. So this evening we have got a very special guest.
She is a solitary
eclectic
wiccan. I had to ask you to read that one out because I wasn't sure what it was. There's so many different ones. For 14 years, she has been focused on paganism, folklore, and folklore throughout history.
So let's welcome her on.
Lana
Duggan.
Hello.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm doing well.
Oh, great.
We are super excited to have you on our podcast this evening. We're going to talk to you about what you do.
Yeah, witches throughout history. They're always turning up. I mean, especially in the UK, they're everywhere, aren't they, girls?
Yeah, especially around here as well, around like the New Forest area.
Yeah, but Burley? Yeah, and it's Wickham as well. From Gerald Gardner that's where it originated from, wasn't it? So we're dying to hear all about your kind of witchcraft. Your kind of witching.
Yeah, really excited. I've never done anything like this before, so it'll be interesting.
So we're going to ask you a few questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Fantastic.
So first of all, solitary Wiccan. What's that all about? Can you explain it to us, please?
So when Wicca first began, it was an initiatory tradition. So you had to be initiated into a coven by another coven member. So it wasn't something you could just pick up and do on your own. Throughout the years, as things evolve, as all religions and practices do, it ended up coming to the masses through Gerald Gardner and other various people. Gerald Gardner is usually always the only one person talked about, but there were a lot of people that contributed to the construction of what Wicca is seen as today. But being solitary mainly means that I work on my own by myself. I don't work with a coven or any other Wiccans. That's pretty much what it means. That I'm all on my own.
So when you say work, what do you actually do? What would you class as?
So when you work on your own, now, anytime that we're talking about this, we talk about your own specific practice. So when you're solitary, you don't have anybody telling you how you need to practice. So within covens, they usually have very set rituals that they do at different times of the year. And mainly things like that, which we'll go over a little bit of that later. I actually have some bullet points to just make sure that I don't forget anything I wanted to specifically talk about. But when you're on your own practicing, no one can tell me I'm doing something wrong. Nobody can tell me that I can't do it this way or that way or whatever feels natural to me. When you're solitary, it's definitely a bit more free flowing. You can incorporate whatever feels right for you, and it makes it a very personalized thing. And I would actually say the majority of Wiccans you're actually going to meet today. I know you guys had Manon on the show. He's one of the first coven members I've really seen talk about his experience. I've met many Wiccans over the years, but I would say if you're going to walk outside, the average Wiccan you're going to meet is going to be a solitary, because you can have that personal connection to it, that you don't need anyone to tell you how you do something. And I think that's very appealing for most people. So but when I say working, what I do now, generally as a Wiccan myself, you have two aspects within Wicca. You have the religious, spiritual aspect, and then you have the witchcraft part of it. So witchcraft in itself is a craft. It's something you do, and you don't have to be a Wiccan to be a witch. You can actually add any religion onto that. You can be a Christian witch. You can be a Buddhist witch. You can be any kind of witch that you want. So when I say work, I mainly am talking about the spell work that I do, which mainly focuses in a folk magic area. So within Wicca, it's a little complicated, right? Like when Wicca first started, it was mainly focused on the ceremonial aspect of Wicca, which comes from Gerald Gardner, which actually that was something I was going to touch on. So I guess we can start with that. Is that he was initiated into a coven called the New Forest Coven, which I'm sure you guys, being close to that area, you guys know about that. And he was also heavily associated with Aleister Crowley, as well as many other various traditions, such as Freemasonry. But we don't actually know much about the New Forest Coven and how their particular practice and traditions were exercised. So it's hard to know how much of their own practice was ceremonial versus like folkloric in nature. So like folk magic we see throughout history, throughout time, certain things that you even do today that you might not even realize it comes from folk magic or a folk tradition, such as like placing a horseshoe above your door, for instance. But yeah, so we don't really know a lot about what their practices were and how that they did their traditions versus what Gerald Gardner kind of just pulled in from other areas, such as Aleister Crowley, who was heavily focused on ceremonial magic. So that's initially how Wicca started. It was very ceremonial in their rituals. But if we actually look throughout time, in paganism itself, they did have some ritual. Well, we don't really know how they practiced, honestly. There's theories that some things were quite ritualistic within their different holidays, such as Samhain and things like that. But a lot was also just about kind of like what we do today, which is about celebrating. But so again, it's going to be very different from different Wiccans. My own basis for magic that I do is heavily based in folk magic, which is heavily based in superstition and different traditions. But, you know, I could go outside and meet another Wiccan, and they're only going to practice ceremonial magic, and that's it. So, yeah. Sorry, I rambled a little bit.
No, that's fine. No, that's
Interesting.
Brilliant. How did you find how did you think that Wicca was the best fit for you, though? Because there's so many out there, isn't there?
There is, and actually, I've explored a lot. I first came into Wicca when I was really young, about 17. I didn't have the greatest concept of what it was. I've been heavily interested in witchcraft ever since I was a very small child. I kind of became obsessed with the Salem witch trials when I was about 9 years old. And I researched everything I could about it. And I can't really tell you what drew me to it. I was fascinated by it. I guess as a child, I was like, well, if they were really doing this to people, that means magic's real, right? So I was like, why would they just do that for no reason? But you know, as you grow and you know, your mind develops, you start to see things differently and understand the world in better ways. But I have dipped my toes in different areas of paganism, mainly continental Germanic paganism, because a lot of my family comes from Germany. Okay. Like my great grandfather was born in Germany and immigrated to the U.S. in 1905. And as well as his wife, they were from Germany as well. So I had a lot of ties there, a lot of roots. And I really explored that a lot. for about a couple of years, but I ended up coming back to Wicca because the way Wicca, I guess the thing that really drew me to Wicca the most is within what we know about history today, and what we know about ourselves through science today. So in Wicca, they venerate a god and a goddess. So that's another bullet point to touch on. There's a lot of misconceptions about the god and goddess and how we see it, and everyone's going to have their own interpretation as well. But it can be somewhat subjective. But there are so many misconceptions about it as being very, very binary. There's a lot of binary terms around it today, having to deal with the gender issues that we see within society going on right now. But the god and goddess are seen as equal. As almost all things in nature, and including people, we all have a feminine and a masculine side to us through estrogen and testosterone. And you see that throughout nature as well. You know, you can have like a mother bear who's going to be very protective and nurturing to her cubs, but as well, she's going to be incredibly fierce against a predator. So within Wicca, you have that aspect of the male and the female divinity. And they are two sides of the same coin. You know, you can't really classify the goddess as being just the female or the god as being just the male. They really are one, and they're balanced. And they, in many ways, I would say that they transcend gender. You know, we put these gender ideas onto them. And it depends on how you want to see that. But, you know, for me and for many Wiccans that I know, that is how it's always been. And throughout some of the earliest priestesses and priests throughout Wicca, such as Selena Fox, would actually say that, yeah, they transcend gender. And to put them in these binary terms is definitely a newer concept. Yeah.
So did your parents get you into it? Were your parents ever into Wicca?
No. Well, my mother was quite spiritual. Oh, but I was it actually answered that whole question. But yeah, that was what really brought me to Wicca, was that idea of the duality within nature and within people just really spoke to me a lot. And I just felt a heavy connection to that, as well as, yeah, I was like, I think there was something else I was going with that, but I ended up losing my train of thought in my ramble, was that as well, all of the, in Wicca, in many instances, they would see all of the gods and goddesses throughout time as being different aspects of the god and goddess. So if you kind of think of like the ocean and how all rivers lead to the ocean, right? So the god and goddess is the ocean, and the rivers are the different gods and goddesses throughout history, all combining into this one. And it's actually not very different from Hindu religious practices, that they have different gods and goddesses, but in their views, it is just another approach and aspect to what they would call the ultimate, which in Wicca for us would be the god and the goddess. So there's a lot of overlap in a lot of things.
Similarities in the Native American culture as well, all very natural in nature and doing ceremonies and things like that. It's very, very similar.
Yeah,
in some aspects.
Yeah, I guess to go back to the other question though. No, my parents are quite spiritual. They always, my dad wasn't really so much, but as he's been getting older, he's been actually becoming very interested in reincarnation. He's always believed in spirits though, and ghosts. And my mother was a heavy believer in reincarnation and astrology, but she never identified with one religion or the other. And my dad, I would actually say, is a Catholic. So
it can be hereditary though, can't it? being a
Yeah,
witch?
it can. So being a Wiccan myself and what I practice, I am definitely of the belief that I think everybody should choose for themselves. As actually Raymond Buckland, another notable person throughout Wicca, had once said that there are many paths to the divine, and there are as many paths as there are people. So I think really whatever is going to connect you to what you view as your higher power, I think that's ultimately what's the most important part. So for my children, I'm not planning on, being like, this is what we are and this is what you have to do. If they're interested in what I do, I will tell them, what it is. We do celebrate the different Wiccan holidays. But it's not something that I make them do. I don't make them celebrate into it. And once they get older, I will introduce them that there's many different religions out there, and whatever works for you is best. And but I will be, but to answer your question, yes, it can be hereditary. I mean, it can be something that you can raise your children in. Does everybody stay in it? It's debatable. It's really up to the individual.
I heard you mention that like add-ons to witches, Christian witches. I did a bit of Googling as well. White witches, green witches, satanic witches. There's another one, a kitchen witch, which if you're
so those
like that.
Again, those are very newer concepts. The kitchen witch, the green witch. When I was growing up, first getting into Wicca, we didn't have those those different terms and labels. Really, what you would say, a kitchen witch or a green witch, would basically just be that there's someone who practices witchcraft, but primarily practices in a certain area. So a green witch would mainly use herbs and different gardening techniques throughout their magical practice. A kitchen witch would mainly use magic in the kitchen, but witches honestly would use magic throughout all areas. But if someone wants to identify as a kitchen witch or a green witch, I think that's totally fine. If you want to put a theme on it, it can be fun. That's definitely newer though, within the past decade as that started popping up.
I think that's a good thing about witchcraft, isn't it? It's all very individual.
Yeah.
There's no
rules,
so to speak.
Yeah, I'm very intrigued about this question that we're going to ask next. I wonder if you can answer it.
Okay.
Go on, girls.
What's the fairy faith?
Yeah, what's the fairy faith? Is that a thing?
Yeah. So it's really not different from how you would view belief in fairies throughout history as well. It's mainly just the belief that fairies still exist today, and there are witches who say that they would work with them, with those spirits. So today, they probably don't really see the fairies as being, actually beings with little wings flying around, or elves as really living out in the forest, these supernatural beings, but they do see them as these spirits that are around us all the time, and that you can work with them in various ways. I have never worked with the faith book myself, with the concept of fairies, but it's definitely something that is definitely worked with today. And but I would definitely advise caution against, not against working with fairies, but just advise caution of being wary, because these ideas of the fae folk that we have are very old, and I think they definitely have an element of truth to them. You definitely want to be careful in your dealings with anything, whether it be fairy spirits or ghosts. So
they like to scratch, don't they? There's some down at Don Styler's gym in the woods there, where there's definitely wisps or something like that. And I remember when my sister was young, she used to see this little thing with eyes and teeth it was a fairy ball that used to roll under her bed or roll and peek behind at the gate. And whether or not it was in her head or anything, but then there is a thought that maybe it could be something like that.
I definitely don't rule out anything. I like to always think that there's always possibilities for anything out there.
That's what we say, isn't it? To all our guests, is we won't poo-poo what you're thinking or seeing.
No.
It's your experience, and if you believe that that's what you've seen,
who are we to
say
that
it didn't happen? It's great.
This is this sounds daft, but hoodoo or voodoo? Does that make any sense to you? Hoodoo
I know hoodoo and voodoo. Yes, they are practices within African traditions. That I personally do not practice hoodoo or voodoo, but I do know hoodoo and voodoo are very they are very close to folk magic in a sense, as at least European folk magic that we would think of. Voodoo and hoodoo definitely take a lot of aspects of sympathetic magic and use it, but it definitely is very specific to a very specific tradition. I generally stay within my ethnic heritage, I would say, which is European. But yeah, that's what hoodoo and voodoo is. It's specific to a very specific tradition. Sorry, what was that?
Do you believe in the rule of three, like the karma thing?
I do. So actually, that's definitely one thing I wanted to touch on. It's I guess there are some other misconceptions within Wicca, that there are many things that have evolved inside of Wicca that may not have necessarily started in Wicca when it was first introduced into the world by Gerald Gardner. The rule of three and the Wiccan Rede are two very good examples here. The rule of three is that whatever you put out into the world, you get back threefold. So as many people are very familiar with the term, you get what you give. So, and I for me, as just on a personal level, I think that that's very true. If you put out negativity in the world, all you're going to get is negativity back. And same thing for positivity. If you put out positivity, you get positivity back. And I think that that's in a way just very natural. And I wouldn't even actually say that that's a Wiccan aspect for me. I think that's just a natural person aspect. But it is something that was introduced into Wicca later on, as well as the Wiccan Rede, which I know that Manon touched on that a little bit. That he also said that was it was kind of brought up in the 70s. And it goes, and harm none, do as you will. And it is something that most Wiccans follow. And I would say it's actually the only thing that most Wiccans would say that is the same for them, at least the majority. It is subjective as well. It is a misconception. Some people coming into Wicca, they might be like, oh, well, I don't like that because that means I can't do baneful magic. And baneful magic would be anything that's like hexing or cursing. And some people want to do that. Some people feel that, if that's their path, if that's what they want to do. But it's very subjective. For me, it's always been that don't go out of your way to harm someone or something. Now, if you need to defend yourself, that can be a different story. But don't go out of your way to just make any harm. But again, it's subjective for everyone. And that, again, that's something that was added on. It's not something that every Wiccans feel the need to follow, and they don't have to if it's not part of their path.
Mm-hmm. Have you ever personally hexed anybody or binded anybody? Or is there a way of being immune to a hex or taking one off yourself?
There is a way to take hexes off of you. You would just do a counter spell. If you feel like you had one on you. I personally did do a hex once when I was young, but I didn't really know what I was doing. So I don't think it really worked anyway. And it was definitely before again, like I said, I didn't have the greatest concept of witchcraft at the time. And I definitely didn't have the same kind of mind view as an adult today. So, but I have never done one since, and I don't think I'll do one again.
Sarah's just popped up there, and she says, one of our guests, she says, is there a spell you won't do, or even if you're asked to do it?
Yes, that would be a love spell.
Oh.
You never want to take away someone's free will. Love spells are very tricky things anyway. They might not always work out the way you want them to. They're just better to stay away from. You could do a love spell on someone and it will most likely work, but it might not work like you want. For instance, you can do one and your lover might come back to you, but their free will is going to be fighting against that spell the entire time. So it most likely will end the same way it did before, because it's not really what they want. And as well, you could end up getting kind of tied in to someone that you realize in the end maybe you didn't want. So it's just they're always tricky things. You just don't want to deal with those.
What kind of things do you use for spell making? Is it candles, herbs, hair?
So for me, again, it's very tied into folk magic, and these are things that people would have done before they even knew the term witchcraft. Most people would have used these things and done these things before and never even thought that they were witches. They would never consider themselves to be a witch. For instance, actually, there was a point in time where priests in Christianity would perform folk magic, but they definitely would not have called themselves a witch. But we see that throughout the historical record. And they're very simple things. Mostly for me, I like to keep it nice and simple. Most of mine would be in the forms of talismans or charms. So like I pretty much keep a hagstone with me all the time. If you guys have ever seen a hagstone, it's a stone with a natural occurring hole in it that you can usually find around a body of water. I'm sure you can find them everywhere in the UK if you go to a river.
Stones, don't we?
Yeah, they're called all kinds of things: hagstones, adder stones, Odin stones. They have so many different names. But these are very magical. If you ever find one, you should keep it. They're very good for protection. So I keep one in my car. I keep one in my bag. I have some on my doorknobs of my house. What makes these magical are definitely it varies between the different locations of these stones as we had found throughout the historical record. But the whole within it is, for me, I've always been inclined to think of the liminal space. So liminal spaces are tended to be magical, a place that's not here nor there. So the whole makes that a liminal space. So, it's a part of the stone and then it's outside of the stone. But yeah, so for me, I also do incorporate a lot of herbs as well. Herbs have a very, very long history of magical use, incredibly long. I do use a lot of crystals as well within my practice, and that's something another misconception a lot of people think is a very new age thing. These crystals have magical properties, but that's something that we see as well throughout the historical record, throughout paganism. For instance, the ancient Egyptians would use carnelian stone to ward against the evil eye.
Yeah.
The average person may not have, had access to, carnelian or like amethyst all the time, but there has always been a belief that almost everything natural around us had a spirit, had an energy, had a form of life. And that's actually stems from animism, which is the oldest belief system that we know to exist. Back at in the early times of man, they would have seen everything as having a spirit, everything is having an energy. And that concept is still with us today through the form of crystals and herbs and things like that.
Wow,
That's
that's
fascinating.
amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So, are you guys going to ask this question, or
So,
you know what we're going to ask, don't you?
so do you worship nature?
No,
And if
you
so,
skipped it.
no, if so, have you ever danced naked under the moon or in a forest?
Should I ask you that as well? Coming. Gotta be done.
I do worship nature. So Wicca in itself is a nature religion. So we actually see the god and goddess. Again, we don't see the god and goddess in these terms of this female goddess in the clouds and this male god in the clouds. As well as, I guess I should touch back on that as well. The god that we worship, it tends to be seen as a horned god, and that's a very old. So the duality here between the god and the goddess was first introduced through Margaret Murray, as well as, so there's a cave painting, right? One of the oldest cave paintings that we know of in France, and it's of a horned figure who has limbs like a man, and this has been theorized to be one of the earliest depictions of deity that there is. Now, some of our earliest figures of goddess worship are seen in Venus figurines, which are these little statues that have bulging bellies, like of a pregnant belly. So something that we see that we've seen throughout time, actually, according to actually, I have her book right here. H.R. Ellis Davidson. So this is actually a book of there we go, Gods and Myths of Northern Europe. So H.R. Ellis Davidson was an incredible folklorist and anthropologist. She actually says here, the usual pattern in early religions is that in which the goddess Mother Earth appears as the wife of the supreme sky god. Since the earth is embraced and made fruitful by the god of the heavens, the image of the earth mother from whom we spring, by whom we are nourished, and into which we return when we die, has remained a fundamental one. So the idea between the god and goddess comes from the theory of early man. So the theory of early man would have seen everything as having spirit. They would have most likely, again, this is just theory, but most likely would have worshipped gods of hunting and goddesses of fertility. Things that we would see as people, that women usually would give birth. So there's our fertility aspect, and men usually would go on the hunt. But the concept, again, though, that puts in a little bit of a binary term, but there was always some exceptions and overlap here. But so it's very nature based is my main point here, and that's something that we still see today, that we don't actually worship them as like this god and goddess in the sky. We see them throughout nature. So like the goddess is heavily associated with the moon, with the ocean. The god is heavily associated with the sun. She is heavily associated with the fertility of the earth, and the god is the sun who brings that life force to the earth. So the best way I would explain the belief behind this and how you see it is, you can think of a god like Poseidon, who is the Greek god of the ocean. Yeah. You wouldn't actually see, like, if you wanted to work or worship with the ocean, you would see it as Poseidon, as personified as a man, but not the actual figure. So yes, long answer there, but I do definitely worship nature for sure. That I see the god and goddess as representations of all of nature. They're within all of it. So, and the funny part of that, no, I've never danced naked under a full moon, but I wouldn't rule it out. Who knows? Maybe someday.
Wax everything.
Yeah.
We had the rose moon the other night. You missed it all. That would have been perfect.
Oh, a nice storm would be all right. There'd be no one about in a storm, would there? It'd be nice and refreshing as well.
Would be nice.
Have you got any witch history for us in your where you are, or do you have anything knowledgeable that you could tell our viewers about witch history?
There's nothing about where I am that I know of. But a little bit of, I guess, little witch history is something that not a lot of people, I think, really know. So there's a lot of ideas about where, the witch's hat and the witch's broom and the black cat come from. And some of them are very known, that we know of. But the one that I've always found really interesting, so we'll never be able to narrow down exactly where these come from. Most likely it's a big collaboration of different things combining into one of what makes us think of witches. But at one point, women were the main brewers. So women would brew the beer. And when people would go into a brewery, women would wear a long pointed hat to signify that they were the brewer. That was their area. And they would generally keep cats a lot to chase after pests, so rats and mice trying to get into their food stores. And as we know as well, like cats really love to be by the hearth, the fireplaces, because it's a nice warm area. So that's I've always found that an interesting tidbit that probably not a lot of people know about.
No.
Oh,
That's clever.
it is clever, isn't it? Yeah. You was on about Reiki earlier, wasn't it? Is that like a healing?
Healing, yeah.
Yeah. Is there spells for healing and wealth and
Yeah,
health?
there's a lot of spells for healing. Reiki is not something that I really incorporate in my practice, but there's Reiki. There's also the chakra system that a lot of people would use in their practice, as well as there's a area of shadow work that a lot of people like to use as well. I generally don't, but usually if you have a lot of trauma in your life, shadow work would be something really interesting to look into. Shadow work is basically you taking the concept of your shadow self, the part of you that is kept hidden from the world, and you embrace that part of yourself through different workings. Something else I guess I'd probably touch on, something that is very important to Wiccans, which Mr. Rana didn't go over too much, is the Wiccan Wheel of the Year. Ooh. So this is something that all Wiccans follow. And actually a good portion of pagans do today. Not all pagans. It depends on what tradition they're doing. But the Wiccan Wheel of the Year consists of 8 central holidays. And most of these holidays we celebrate today just as regular people. Most of our holidays actually today stem from pagan holidays that can sometimes have a little bit of overlap in Christianity too. Samhain being one of them. Samhain was the earliest form of Halloween that we have today.
Yes.
So that's something that would have been heavily practiced throughout mainly the Celtic region.
Sorry. Sorry.
Get in your bed.
That's okay.
Sorry. I'm holding her.
Joining.
As you were.
So Samhain was seen as a very liminal time. It was the time when between the spirit world and our world was at its thinnest. And that is how it is still for us today. people would, make masks. Because there was this idea around Samhain that if you, the spirit world, it wasn't just, intermingling with ours. Not only could the spirits come into our world, but you could wander off into the spirit world as well. So they would wear masks and carve, not jack-o'-lanterns at the time, usually turnips, things to try to keep bad spirits away. But they would be welcoming usually their family back into the home. But our concept of Halloween today actually comes from not only Samhain, but there were some mainly throughout England. God, my mind is slipping here. What it was called All Souls Day. It was actually like the day after Halloween, and there was this idea that a lot of souls could get trapped in purgatory between heaven and hell, and if they got enough prayers for that particular soul, it would be able to ascend out of purgatory and go into heaven. So our trick-or-treating aspect for Halloween comes mainly from that. So you would actually have beggars and young children who would go from door to door, and people would make these things called soul cakes, and these tiny little round cakes, and which was more like it was a bit more bread-like, and they would be like, well, give me a soul cake, and I'll give you a prayer for the loved one that you want to be raised up to heaven. So that's where our trick-or-treating aspect comes from. So a lot of it can really overlap. But mainly we have Samhain. So Samhain would actually be like what they call the Witches' New Year. So instead of January 1st for Wiccans, that is the new turn. And these holidays mainly follow the natural cycle of the sun. So we have Yule, which generally falls on the winter solstice, or the darkest night of the year. But even though generally, there goes the headphone. Generally, throughout where Yule would have been mainly practiced within the Germanic areas, Yule would actually consist over several days. Today, though, we would just Wiccans mainly focus on the winter solstice, which is the longest night of the year. And these dates can vary depending on the year. Generally, it's usually about December 21st. And then we go into Imbolc, which later in Christianity actually became Candlemas. And then we go into Ostara, which today, as we would know as Easter, which actually comes from the goddess Eoster, who was an Anglo-Saxon goddess. And it means the new dawn. That is the spring has arrived. Mm-hmm. And that's interesting too. It's generally, again, it's mainly celebrated in March at the spring equinox. But again, throughout the historical record, Ostara, we know Eoster was generally celebrated in the month of April. And that's actually in Easter, we still do that. And we have Beltane, or May Day, or in Germany, it's Walpurgisnacht. And then we have Litha, which is actually coming up very soon, next week, which is our summer solstice, which is the longest sun, the longest day of the year.
It's 21st.
Oh.
Yep. And then we have Lunasa. Lunasa is a harvest time. So that's it's kind of like, all right, let's start preparing for winter. And then we have Mabon, which is another harvest festival, and then Samhain being the last harvest festival. Mm-hmm. But yeah, and that's something that we sell. I mean, even if you don't know it, you in a way are kind of celebrating the wheel.
There's some rituals I think that they do. They feed cider to an apple tree for a good harvest, and to
rituals. There, so many things can be ritual. For you, it's very personal. For me, for instance, for Samhain, I usually will bury an apple in my front yard, and I do that to for any of the dead who have passed on recently, as well as your ancestors, so that they have something to eat on the other side.
Yeah, amazing.
Is there anywhere in the world you'd like to go and sort of that inspires you for witchcraft?
There are many places I would love to go, but generally I definitely would love to visit Germany. Even though Germany, again, I think you and I had talked about this a little bit, that the witch hunts of Europe, nearly half of it was just in Germany, which is insane. So that's not the best place for inspiration, but I think the history would be amazing, especially since some of my family comes from there. But a good portion of my family on my mother's side actually comes from Scotland, and that is actually, from what I understand anyway, because I've never been there, is there's almost no better place for superstition than the Highlands.
Definitely.
So yeah, I would definitely love to visit Scotland someday.
Well, if you're ever over this way, look us up. We'll you're more than welcome to come see us.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Meet you up to the New Forest.
Yeah, absolutely. Stonehenge.
There's some witch stones.
Yeah, Stonehenge. That would be amazing to see Stonehenge.
It's literally less than an hour down the road. So.
Oh wow.
As a solitary person, do you go to any of the festivals? Because like I've been to the Beltane Festival and places like that. Do you go to any of them?
No, I actually have never been. Just because I've just never lived in an area which had that. I would love to though.
We'll take you.
What?
We'll take you.
Do a big festival.
Yeah, I would love to. Yeah, I've never been, which I'm hopefully someday.
Yeah, you should definitely.
So, who's your most inspirational witch then, past or present?
I mean, I feel like it's a little bit of a cop-out to say because this particular witch is just so well known. But, I think he gets kind of a bad rap today, and I would say that's Scott Cunningham. A lot of people would say that Raymond Buckland was the one that brought Wicca to the U.S., which is true. But I would say Scott Cunningham probably had the largest influence on what Wicca is today, how it's practiced today, and just the solitary path in general. I would say most Wiccans as well today, when they first start out their journey, that is who they read. That is the very first person that they go to. And I think a lot of his practices and traditions that he introduced from his own practice are just largely applicable to us today as well, just as much as they were when he first published his first book. Mm-hmm. So,
right, we're going to wrap it up with just one more question, and it's just a fun question. So I do hope you got a sense of humour. Here's a big curveball I'm going to throw at you now. So, favorite witches. Are you ready for this?
Okay.
Right.
Go. The Sanderson sisters.
The witch from The Wicked Witch of the Wizard of Oz.
Samantha
Stevens from Bewitched.
Hermione Granger from Harry Potter.
Or the Blair Witch. Who would you say was your favourite? I must say, if there was a Blair Witch, at least she's creative. She'll lob off some fingers and scare you in your tent.
And put some cool figures out in there.
Yeah, indeed.
I'd probably say the Sanderson sisters, because they're just so iconic. Everybody kind of grows up with them, don't they?
Are you looking forward to Hocus Pocus 2 coming out?
I am, and I'm not. I just hope they don't ruin it. But I'll definitely be watching it when it comes out. See how it goes.
Definitely looking forward to that one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
yeah. Thank you very much for your time today.
And all your information was marvelous. We've definitely learned something, haven't we, girls?
Absolutely. Yeah.
It was amazing.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Catch you another time.
Take it easy.
Ciao for now.
Bye.
Bye.